Listen, this is weird for me, but today we are the story. And by we, I mean the CBC. You've seen all the calls to defund the CBC. There's going to be a new president starting soon, and I think this is a crossroads moment. So today, what some critics have to say about the CBC. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, this is not an easy conversation for us, but also we can't avoid it. There have always been calls to defund the CBC, but now those calls are louder, right? They have political representation. Specifically, the leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, he's promising this is something he'll do if he's elected. Now, last week, a new president of the CBC was appointed, and let's just say she has got her work cut out for her. Marie-Philippe Bouchard will take over from Catherine Tate in January, and it's a moment when the future of the public broadcaster has never been more in doubt. Whether you love it or hate it, this is one of the most important publicly funded cultural institutions in the country, and all of us, we have a stake in what happens next. On Friday, this Friday on Commotion, you're going to hear from some people who defend the CBC. They see its value to us as a country, and they'll tell us why, but not today. Today, we are inviting our critics in. Rupa Subramanya is here, Sabrina Maddeaux is here, and Harrison Lowman is here. Rupa, Sabrina, and Harrison, welcome to the group chat.
Hey, Elamin.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I'm delighted that you're all here. Look, this is awkward because it's kind of like I'm saying, like, hey, come into my house, say it directly to my face, but also, you're in my house, would just say it directly to my face. I want to hear from all of you. Rupa, I'm going to start with you. Why do you think the CBC should be defunded?
Well, first and foremost, I don't think that taxpayers should be funding for all of this. Whatever we see on the CBC, whatever we hear on the CBC, $1.3 billion is where it stands now. That's how much the CBC is costing the taxpayers. And I'll tell you, given my own personal background, I'll tell you, when I first arrived in Canada, I came here as an international student more than a quarter century ago, and I would watch the CBC religiously. I would watch The National, which was hosted by Peter Mansbridge. Mm-hmm. And after the main news, there was this commentary segment called Point of View. And
Rex Murphy.
It was hosted by Rex Murphy.
Yeah.
And Rex's take on events of the week was always no nonsense, cut through the BS, everything from, he was defending the indigenous seal hunt. It's not exactly a fashionable cause to defend. Sure. And he did that without fear of censure or cancellation. He wasn't afraid of being unpopular. It had an intellectual impact on me at that age. I'd lived in all of these places before coming to Canada, in the Middle East and in India, where in these places you speak your mind at your own peril. So right. It felt liberating and cathartic to be in this environment in Canada where someone like Rex, could fire with both barrels, basically, without concern that he would be fired from his job. See, those were different times.
That's a fair question. I think that is. I just want to pause you there. I think that is a fair question to ask. I think it's a fair question to ask. But a voice like Rex Murphy's, does the CBC have the equivalent of that now? I think you're right. I don't think that exists in the moment. I'm not sure that translates to, and therefore it should be defunded. But I want to come back to that. I'm basically trying to gather all of the points that you all have and then get into them a little bit more in detail. I now have the pleasure of asking Harrison Lowman. Harrison, look, I've known you for a long time. This has been a recurring conversation literally every time that I see you. And we've known each other for 13 years at this point. An obsession that you have. But now you get to say it, instead of just yelling it in my ear while I'm sitting in your house just trying to have a drink with you, you get to say it to a national audience. What's wrong with the CBC? Harrison, go.
Let me preface this by saying that I worked for the CBC. I believe in the idea of the CBC, if it's able to meet its mandate. But I am here to warn the CBC, having speak to conservatives sort of every day. It is on borrowed time. I have it on good authority. It is within Pierre Poilievre's, first 100-day plan to take a chunk out of the CBC. Now, we don't know what that means. We can define, defund, et cetera. But he will move on this, and he will move on the CBC within his first 100 days in office. From where I sit, speaking to people, having been obsessed over this thing for many years, I think there's three issues. It comes with mirroring the public back at itself, comes with the tone a lot of you folks take in terms of stories, and it comes with your coverage. So
a lot of you folks, a lot of you,
folks, folks
okay.
is you could use the term freely.
And I will.
So I increasingly think you guys are speaking to a very small slice of Canada, an educated, more progressive urban elite. You hear this word thrown around, that you're increasingly speaking to the annex, that they're the ones with their radios tuned into the CBC. I knew things were bad when those on the left started being critical. This quote from Stephen Marsh a few weeks ago on Candleland, a pretty well-known Canadian writer. The CBC is not contributing to a consensus reality. It is an ideologically captured institution that is listened to by an increasingly fewer number of people exactly because it does not reflect Canadian reality. Who are you not reflecting? There's a cast of characters here. People from rural Canada, people who are right of center, people who are non-university educated who work in the skills trade, non-progressive folks, religious folks, or center-left folks who might criticize what Rupa kind of described there, the excesses of identity politics. They might also say you're covering America too much. You're not focusing on our country. In terms of the tone, this is what I hear. It's sort of a we know best, preachy, patronizing, sort of talk down to you tone. And then sort of finally, in terms of what you're covering, by all means, and I know the criticism that will be launched at me, when this goes to air in terms of, what I look like in my family background is being a white guy. But I think you can objectively say that, yes, so focus on social justice issues. They should be a slice of what you're covering in terms of the pie and what you're covering, but they should not be almost the whole pie. And that's what I hear from people, that it's an increasingly the whole pie.
Sabrina, okay, I want to get into some numbers with you because a fiscal year is costing about $1.8 billion a year to run the CBC. We receive $1.38 billion in funding from the government, as Rupa mentioned earlier. That works out to about $33 per year per person. To put that in perspective, that is 4 times less in the UK, 8 times less in Germany. Do you think the government should be scrapping all of that funding?
So when we talk about defunding, it can mean different things to different people.
Sure.
My version of defunding is not taking CBC to zero and completely demolishing it, because I do think it's a storied institution in our country and can offer value as a public broadcaster.
Oh, thank you, Sabrina. That's very kind of you.
Anytime. It's not offering enough value right now. This mandate has become so broad and so large and so unfocused that 1.8 billion is being spent, taxpayer funds are being spent on developing game shows, on CBC comedy, on, now this might be a little bit awkward to say, but like dozens of podcasts that, when you look at the actual audience reported numbers, aren't necessarily being listened to by a large majority of Canadians, or even developing their own very strong niche audiences. In terms of online content and a lot of opinion commentary that can be filled in the private sector, it seems that the CBC has really lost its way. And its original mandate, which is much more focused on providing coverage and services in areas that the private sector won't. And that can be local news, that can be some language services. There's an argument to be made, I think, for investigative journalism, which has largely disappeared in the private sector because of funding restraints there. I think we need to talk about what the CBC should be focused on. It should be, a much narrower field, and that will come with less funding. And at the same time, though, more value for taxpayer dollars. And the second part of that defunding slice is that the CBC is competing with private sector media for ad dollars while having this great advantage of government funding. So it's actually hurting the broader private media sector and stifling competition and innovation, which a public broadcaster should not be doing. It should be supporting the ecosystem, not taking away from it.
Elamin, can I just mention one thing? Like, just to add to Sabrina's point. Okay. Just go on the subway in Toronto. You'll see the CBC ads. This is how it describes itself. It's not how Canadian you are. It's not how Canadian you are. It's who you are in Canada. It's a CBC thing. I don't know what that means. I could send that off to translators of various languages. I don't think they could translate it.
I mean, you're talking about a slogan.
They're trying to do everything.
Fine.
I don't know.
You're talking about a slogan that runs in an ad campaign, and like that is fine. If you like look at a slogan,
but if you don't know who we are, how are we supposed to know who you are?
I get it. I get that argument. But I actually want to go back to the thing that Sabrina's talking about, because I think that is more rooted in a more real thing. Because I think like an ad campaign is like a little bit flimsy. Some people can read into it and go like, I understand what that is. And some people can say, I don't. But here's the thing that matters to me is the piece about the mandate. If you're talking about the mandate, and I'm in the awkward position of maybe defending the CBC on the CBC, but I'm not necessarily trying to. I'm just trying to raise objections to some of the points that you guys have raised. But if you sort of look at like the idea of the original mandate, are we talking about in 1936? Because of course that mandate has evolved. One of the mandates of this organization is to inform. Another one is to entertain. That is one of the things that the CBC is asked to do by its government. So I just want to, if you don't mind, Harrison, I'm just going to read you some of the current CBC mandate, because the government is actually right now in the final stages of drafting what could be a pretty significant sort of regulatory change. So while we wait for this updated mandate, here's some of the stuff that the current mandate actually says that CBC needs to do. It needs to be predominantly and distinctively Canadian, reflect Canada and its region to national and regional audiences while serving the special needs of those regions, actively contribute to the flow and exchange of cultural expression, contribute to a shared national consciousness and identity, reflect the multicultural, multiracial nature of Canada. Those are things that the CBC is currently directly asked to do. And I know that we could spend like hours debating what distinctively Canadian means, or like what a shared national consciousness means, because those are porous definitions, right? Like everybody sort of reads something different into them. But if we sort of put a bracket around that for now, what is at stake for you, Harrison, if you say like, oh, okay, there's no CBC to do these things, particularly when it comes to like arts and entertainment? Because I'm thinking here of a show like Race Against the Tide. You could say CBC should be out of the business of doing reality shows, but also it's
ask if anyone here has heard of it.
But that's not the question. That is not actually the question. The question is,
I have never heard of it.
That's fine. That's not what this is about. It's about the idea that there is a show that is set in New Brunswick in the Bay of Fundy that the CBC makes that the privates would not make. So my question to you, Harrison, is like, what happens if the CBC is not there to do that? Are the privates going to step up to do that? Because this is the current mandate of the organization as it stands.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to make a joke and say if a CBC show falls in the forest, but no one hears the show.
Don't duck the question with a joke. This is not your house. This is a real show. Okay,
I'm going to pull the lens back here. Okay, we live in the second biggest country in the world.
Yes.
It is full of vibrant communities with vastly different interests, priorities, languages, etc. When and if the CBC ever fulfilled its mandate, and it's living up to that promise, it is a national broadcaster that is the sinew between all these different communities, and it is bringing them together.
Yes.
It is informing them through the largest journalistic outlet in the world, in the country. It is providing a platform for artists, like you mentioned there, okay?
Yeah.
You know, I'm just going to lodge a little bit of criticism in here because you asked me to do that. People I hear from say, yes, the national broadcaster should allow for criticism about said country when necessary, but it should be the exception, not the norm. They would say that it's increasingly become the norm, that it's not a patriotic national broadcaster.
Patriotism is not the job. Reflection
I know it's
is
not the job. I know it's not the job. But again, think of that pie.
Okay.
I would say if we lose this thing, this has been repeated, but with almost 100-year-old institutions, and I'm an institutions guy, it is very easy to get rid of things. It is very hard to build them up. You would not create the CBC in 2024. I still think it has value for Canada. It's a place where musicians can get their start. It's a place where a lot of journalists can get their start. And maybe that's focusing more on the local side of things, and that's the value add there. But sorry, you want to interrupt me?
I do. I'm sorry. The time is so limited. I want to ask the same question to Rupa, because like to me, arts and entertainment still are as vital an offering in the mandate as the offering of news. Right? When it comes to national identity, you get that from news, yes, but you get it from entertainment, and you get that from arts, from reflecting the country back to itself. I think the point that you made earlier, Rupa, is that actually privates are able to do that, and I'm saying, I don't know of a private broadcaster in this country who's willing to do that, with the exception of like maybe Amazing Race Canada. Like that's like the only other show that can be like, hey, here's how the rest of the country looks like and exists. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So Elamin, so this reality TV show that you mentioned, I assume
this is not a referendum on Race Against the Tide, but yes, 100%. Yes.
It's on CBC TV. So,
Yeah.
and here's the bizarre thing about CBC TV. If anything that should be defunded and privatized immediately, it should be CBC TV. Why are taxpayers funding a successful commercially viable programs? It's state funded and it's commercial, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. It beggars the mind. CBC TV is, it has commercials. So you can't say on the one hand that, we're doing something that the market will not provide, and then go ahead and sell commercials into that market. So for me, when it comes to something like the CBC TV, if these shows are commercially viable, it's a no-brainer. CBC television should be spun off, privatized, and face the test of competition, sink or swim.
And can I just add, go on the CBC YouTube page right now, and some of these shows, 40 views on YouTube. I'm not kidding you. That's not an exaggeration. I don't know what
that is not a show that lives on YouTube. It's a show that lives on CBC Gem. But I appreciate your point that some of the YouTube content for CBC does not have the viewership that you would expect it to have. That is a point well taken. I want to put this to Sabrina. Sabrina, like this idea of the CBC also doing the thing where it reflects the country in arts and entertainment, and not just in news. I think it's important to have a publicly funded institution, and I should say, like Rupa said, state funded. And I think that's a little bit of a different thing. It's a publicly funded institution.
What Elon wants.
Yeah, exactly. It's a publicly funded institution. To me, that's a vital part of making arts and entertainment in this country. That is not an opinion that is shared by this table, and that is okay. But what's your take on that?
I think there is a place for the CBC to play a role in arts and culture. You're right that the private sector doesn't fulfill that need entirely.
Will not, right?
And won't.
Yeah.
But it can't be just because this isn't our mandate and just because we think this is like a moralistically good thing. People actually have to want that content. Again, that content needs to be valuable. And maybe there are new ways of distributing that content and getting it to Canadians. But right now, it seems like Canadians aren't finding that or watching it. I think the numbers play that out. And they're not finding the value in it. So we talk about a show that's maybe meant to elevate Canadian artists or musicians. How many of those are actually ending up being elevated? Like, is the content working and achieving its goals? I don't think we're seeing any real evidence of that. And there's been a reluctance by the CBC to really ask itself those tough questions and push itself into new territories. And that's where I think a lot of the frustration comes in for Canadians, and, the lack of value argument gets raised.
I will say this, that there is something to be said about the numbers game that people often want to play when they talk about the success of something that the CBC makes or CBC has acquired. And to me, of course, that is a part of the conversation because that is how you show that you are serving the country. But the other thing to talk about is that it's going to be difficult no matter what for us to get the same numbers that privates do, because a good example of this is Amazon Prime just purchased this documentary about the Tragically Hip, which 10, 15 years ago, Harrison, you would have immediately went, this Tragically Hip documentary obviously belongs on the CBC. That the market has changed in such a way that I don't think the public broadcaster has the necessary money to even enter the conversation to be able to acquire such a thing. That is one of the changes in the markets. And so you have to look at it and say that's another thing we're going to lose. Even though in 2016 CBC aired the final concert for the Tragically Hip.
It was excellent.
Yeah, exactly right. And so I just want to keep kind of reminding us of all of this. I also feel like this is a good time to share that the survey that we heard about last week from McGill University's Center of Media, Technology and Democracy, the majority of Canadians want to see the CBC keep operating. 78% of those people of people polled feel that way. When it comes to increasing or maintaining funding, well, that number is a little bit less. It is still over half that people want to keep the CBC funded. Harrison's well, boy, if this is where we're at, we're really in trouble. My name is Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. This is Commotion. On the CBC today, we've got our critics. Our critics are in the house. Rupa Subramanya writes for the Free Press. Sabrina Maddeaux is a freelance columnist. And Harrison Lowman is a managing editor of The Hub. Look, in the days ahead, we're going to be hearing the case for the CBC. That is not today's conversation, obviously not the vibe right now. Today, it's all about why the movement to defund the public broadcaster is landing in a different way at the moment. Take a listen to this.
And we'll save $1 billion by defunding the CBC.
Harrison, you've been at these rallies. Would you take me into the room? Is that a typical reaction to that comment?
It's been said before, but I think Polyev gets the loudest response from saying he's going to defund the CBC, and his new line is, walk to the building you're currently recording in this today and turn it into housing for Canadians. So just to your previous point, like there are people in the room, there's partisans that are salivating at that line and can't wait to get their hands on the CBC. There's also, from the poll you described, what I'm most concerned about, and I say all this with love. I say this as someone who wants the CBC to thrive and do what it's supposed to do. And as someone who's worked for two public broadcasters, CBC and TVO, the demise of the CBC will not come at the hands of the people in that rally room. It will come from what I kind of feel is a growing public indifference. You know, less people willing to fight to defend you in an upcoming election and to vote for saving the CBC. The danger territory, and I felt this myself, is being a public broadcaster that increasingly becomes nice to have as opposed to must have. And that should be the worry. People won't fight for the things that are nice to have.
Okay, my name is Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. Rupa, you're about to respond to the thing that Harrison was just saying there. Go.
Exactly. So you see, the larger point here, Elamin, is you have a state-funded broadcaster, or rather publicly funded broadcaster. I want to be polite here.
Thank you. Very generous of you. A lot of generosity in the room today. Yeah.
You know, it's being all things to all people, and it's not doing a good job. And the CBC represents, to me, an overly socialized Canada where the private initiative is essentially stifled. Where's the competition in the telecom sector? Where's the competition when it comes to media? Where's the competition when it comes to medicine? Look, you've gotten me started now. You know, the point is, where's the market test in all of this? You know, and I object to the notion that we need the government, that is taxpayers, bailing us out, whether it's the CBC or even the private media for that matter. I used to be a columnist for the National Post. The National Post gets money from the government. You know, here's what I want to say. You know, and I'm very exercised about this now. You know,
I get your physical language has changed. You're like, my shoulders are up. I'm ready to go.
You know, how do you explain? Here's a question for you. How do you explain the success of Canadians south of the border who are operating in a competitive market environment? They don't have taxpayers bailing them out all the time. And I'll give you one, you know, a tiny example. You know, I work for an American media company, the Free Press, which is based out of New York. I am just one of many Canadians who excel south of the border, where things like risk-taking, hard work, thinking big, entrepreneurship, all of these things are rewarded. And we thrive. My company thrives not because of taxpayers' dollars.
But the explanation is the size of the market, Rupa. The explanation is that there's 300 million people who could buy the product versus there's 30 million in this one.
I do not accept the size of the market argument anymore, because you can find comparable markets around the world, in Europe, or in Asia, where these things, where private entrepreneurship and risk taking and are rewarded in a really big way.
You can, but I think all those countries have a larger funding for their public broadcaster than us. That's worth also pointing out.
The bottom line here is, if you have a good product, you have subscribers and supporters. It's as simple as that. People will want to pay for it. We've forgotten that basic lesson in Canada, where the government is always ready to write a check for you and bail you out when you're failing. And unfortunately, I see the CBC in that category.
Sabrina, I have a different take on this, which is that even if the government got out of the business of saying, you know what, we should just prop up a broadcaster for no reason, I think there is a good cultural story to tell about having a public broadcaster. It doesn't have to do everything, right? Like, you sort of like be very specific about the things that it's asking for. But to me, like, that is a values-based argument, not a money-based argument, not a market-based argument. It is like, it's within the values of this country to have a public broadcaster that attempts to tell the story of the country back to itself. It is a relationship. Like, I would continue to pay for this public service. I'd continue to participate in it, actually specifically because it will show things that like don't enter my daily reality otherwise. Like, I think that is a part of what I want to get out of the CBC. Am I completely off base here, do you think?
So I think you touch on something with the values there. And the problem is that Canadians don't see their values generally reflected in the CBC. And I don't think it's, oh, I give this amount of dollars and I need to see my exact self and my exact political opinions
To the
on
percentage.
TV onto the percentage. However, there is a real feeling that there's so much bias in one direction on the CBC and so much of one certain type of viewpoint, but that's why you're seeing those reactions at Pierre's rallies and his fundraisers. I've been in those rooms too. It is the biggest applause line. It gets great reaction because those people feel like the CBC is actively antagonistic towards them and their worldview and actively working against them. And, you know, like, I think that there is something to that, where there is certain viewpoints that are more commonly covered and propelled by CBC. Now, do I think that you have journalists walking in a room meaning to be biased, or do I think there's orders coming down from up top that you have to be promoting the Liberal Party? No, but there are certain systemic issues within the CBC, including the fact that it's become so centralized in downtown Toronto. And when you have a large part of your workforce in downtown Toronto, you're going to have a certain type of viewpoint that aligns with those sort of views that are common in downtown Toronto. When you look at the union and you have a workforce that the union protects older workers who have been around a long time with the same sorts of viewpoints and ideas versus younger workers who often end up on contracts and in more temporary work situations. That's a problem as well. You're not going to have the same diversity of ideas. And just geographically, like we had talked about before, there hasn't been enough representation and focus on communities and local moments, local stories where people are going to feel heard and represented.
Okay, I want to play you guys just real quick. I want to play you a clip of the current president and CEO of CBC, Catherine Tate.
When you talked about the state funding of the public broadcaster, there's a whole pile of things that we do at CBC Radio-Canada that isn't commercially viable. We run a service in the north. We are the lifeline to thousands of Indigenous people, serving them in their language. There's no commercial broadcaster that would go into that market. Similarly, the French language outside of Quebec. You know, certain communities where there's no money to be made. So I think that's an important piece of this too.
Harrison, when you hear that, what's your response?
My response is that sadly, the CBC at this point in time sounds a lot like the federal Liberals. And that's unfortunate.
Come on, that's not a fair response. That's not
because it's not partisan. It's ideological. Just sit with me for a
but we're talking about programming choices, about people who would otherwise not hear their language anywhere. And you're saying that that's a mirroring of a political party.
Well, I can't.
That's not a
is
fair
the problem.
response. I don't
the person giving the message, overrides the message that's being given. And this is one of the issues.
I don't think Marshall McLuhan said that. I don't think that was the quote. Okay, continue.
No, I do think there have been, I want to piggyback on that, issues with your outgoing president where she has said to media before things about the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, and she has brought it into that partisan style argument. So part of the problem is that leadership has made this more partisan than perhaps it needed to be. And now when people hear quotes by her, they see it in a certain frame.
I think those stories certainly color how you see the story. Sorry to cut you off there, Harrison. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you're not going to win people over with her comments about you being the beacon of truth, fighting back against a tsunami of disinformation, which is now a buzzword because disinformation is in the eye of the beholder. What I mean to say is, similar to the federal Liberals, this is not partisan, this is just ideological. Federal Liberals, CBC, both on borrowed times in large way, led by people who don't have that self-awareness, who have that sort of holier-than-thou tone. And sadly, you now have a federal government dipping its toe into this and making you guys a political wedge. They now have a campaign about how you should save the CBC, et cetera, and then are now unintentionally politicizing you. I don't think we need them added to the conversation. It's all very unfortunate.
But what's interesting about this, maybe I'll put this to Rupa, is like neither Harrison nor Sabrina are actually that interested in the thing that Catherine said, because you're saying, maybe what you're saying is like, it's gotten so politically loaded that you don't even hear that argument. Like the idea that she just said,
of course, I care about indigenous languages. They need to be preserved, and the CBC should play a
role
role
in doing so. But that's not what you said. But that's not the thing you said.
You could do
When I
that
put it to
very
you-
narrow part of your mandate with
Yes.
a lot less funding, though, right? And all the other areas that
Well, I'm
we've
not saying
talked
that's the
about where
only
funding
thing the
is more
CBC will
wasteful.
do, but I'm saying that is one of the things the CBC will do. That is, as she pointed out in that little answer.
She's pointing at something over here, and there's a fire behind her. That's what I'm saying. The
Yeah.
place,
Sure.
like this is, and there's like 3 fire alarms that have been pulled. And thankfully now you guys are having a conversation and being introspective about this. But I'm growing increasingly worried. That's what I'm trying to say.
Rupa, you want to say something?
On indigenous programming, by all means, do it. But you can curate this. You don't need this mammoth CBC footprint to do this. You don't need $1.3 billion to do this sort of thing. It's basic mathematics. What is your return on the investment that you're getting? You've talked a lot about reflection and that the country needs to be reflected back in some of this programming.
Yeah.
What exactly is that? What does that look like? Is it reflection of your skin color? Is it ethnic diversity? Is it religion? Is it country of origin?
Hopefully it's all of the above. Hopefully it's everything that you just said.
No. My problem is that I crave diversity of opinion. That's what I'm looking for. Even though people know where I'm coming from, I'm always looking for something that challenges my worldview. So diversity of ethnicity is great and all of that. It looks visually very interesting and it makes us look very tolerant and everything. But are you really hiring the best person for the job? Do you really have the best content on the CBC? Are you just doing this because they represent a certain minority group? So I have a problem with that because that'll eventually lead to mediocre outcomes. My bigger problem is the lack of diversity of thought and opinion, especially on the news and current affairs part of the CBC. So, basically many Canadians, I think, feel disenfranchised by the CBC, and our tax dollars are paying for this progressive elite view, which is coming out of these big cities, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, you name it. But there's a lot of the country, and I think Harrison mentioned this earlier, that, they don't relate to this, including yours truly, by the way. And we're all wondering, why are our tax dollars funding any of this?
Again, it's a real struggle because my job here isn't to push back. But I you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to take issue with a part of the thing that you just said, because I think one of the challenges that I'm having as I sort of listen to this argument is actually Harrison was perfectly kind of laid out in this new Paul Wells column that he just put out a couple days ago, which he said that like politics has kind of shifted to be entirely about election day coverage, like about sort of obsessing with like what's going to happen on election day. So as a result, all this polarization is like, not only is it at a head, it's at like a constant level, a constant heightened level. And political coverage is not just about election day, nor is it about political outcomes. It is actually about the politics and how it's remaking the country. And I do think when it comes to how the country is being remade, I think we do the best journalism in the country. And I'll say that to anybody. And I genuinely mean that. I think our journalists do the best work when it comes to how the country's being remade. Is it reflecting the level of anger? No. But I also don't think that's the CBC's job.
What does remade mean?
I think the country's changing all the time, and I think we're actually the best at covering how the country's changing. I don't think we're the best at covering the anger of this country at the moment, nor do I think that's the job. Nor do I think the job of the CBC is to sort of be at the pulse of all the populist pushback. And I think it would be a mistake to hear what I'm saying as saying all the criticisms of CBC and the critics of CBC are just angry. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there's a mood, and I don't know if we're covering the mood as well. And I think that speaks to the thing that you're talking about earlier, Harrison, about the idea of there are people who don't have their feelings validated by the CBC when they like listen to it or watch it. And I'm like, yeah, that's true, but we're covering all the issues. I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that the issues are not being covered by this organization and covered not just well, but the best in the country. Like I stand by that, not just because I draw a paycheck out of this place. I genuinely mean that.
I think it's easy to paper over frustration and legitimate demands by calling them like anger or like bigotry.
Well, they are
or,
anger. I did say bigotry. I would never say that. There is frustration. There's political frustration. That's a real thing.
But there are underlying issues that led to that anger and disillusionment, right?
Sure.
So when you say the CBC has covered all of these issues and is the best in the country, was the CBC, for example, covering the massive increase in immigration numbers that even the Liberals have now walked back?
Of course we have been. Of course we've been covering those.
Well, you covered the news that those happened, but was there any actual analysis or critique of those numbers and the outcomes that they would have?
CBC Charlottetown has done the best coverage of how a small town is responding to the pressures of a massive influx of immigration. This is what I mean, is that like, I think we cover the issues. I don't think we cover them with a tone. I don't think that's the job. I think, in fact, the job is to stay away from the tone.
No, but the tone is very obvious, right, Elamin? It's not just a figment of, by the way. It's not just a figment of our imagination. There is a
we have to give examples. Go ahead, Rupa.
Give you an example. The truckers' protest. And I live here in Ottawa, and the CBC essentially sounded like it was parroting the talking points from the PMO. That's exactly what it sounded like.
Rupa. Jamie Passant went into the encampments of the truckers and recorded
the coverage was good.
And it was one of the best conversations I've heard about the trucker convoy protest. She was in there. Like, this is what I mean, is like, I don't think we're doing the mood.
That's one example.
Okay,
go ahead.
Look
at, how much are you covering business economics at this point? Skepticism around MAID, safe supply, immigration, as Sabrina mentioned. I listen to shows. I listen to World Report every day. And I hear it now getting into hard news in that I'm listening to a story and it's a contentious subject. And then I'm waiting for another voice to come on because I know there's people that disagree with this issue. And then it just fades to the next segment. You guys cover transgender issues, which are obviously highly contentious. And this world-renowned CAS report that comes out a few months ago, and 4 doctors are interviewed about how bad it is. Like, there are other opinions here that are increasingly mainstream in other countries. But here in Canada, our national public broadcaster is not bringing those ideas forward. And thus people listen and they think, I'm increasingly frustrated because I literally don't hear what I think brought forward through the public broadcaster's channels.
I will say, I'm conscious of the fact that I was like, please come into our house and criticize us. And then I got mad at you guys, and I didn't mean to do that. And that makes me a rude host when you come into my house and go like, okay, tell me everything you think. And I go, no, except for that one thing. I don't want to hear it. So in the spirit of that, Sabrina, you are now in charge of the new CBC mandate because we haven't seen the new mandate yet. But Sabrina's going to do it, and she's going to do it to future-proof the CBC. Tough job, pal. Go for it.
Definitely a tough job. But I think you have to focus on a few key things.
Okay.
One, not be as defensive as an organization.
You mean me or do you mean the CBC? Both.
The CBC as a whole,
okay.
Especially with the statements that have been given to the press and stuff from the outgoing president. But I think as an organization as a whole, conversations like this are good. This is transparent. This is debate. This isn't defensive. You're really allowing a consideration of what the CBC could look like in the future, even though you might disagree with some or a lot of what we're saying.
Yeah.
So I think starting to get ahead of that wave that is very much coming your way. It's crisis comms 101. You can't wait for the wave to hit you. You need to get out and actually be proactive in responding to the concerns of Canadians and taking them seriously rather than writing them off. I think then the next thing I would do is, again, like I talked about before, really focus that mandate. What can you cut? I think a lot can be cut. Focus on the things that deliver the most value to Canadians. And then I also think look at what we've been talking about with diversity of geography and opinion in terms of making sure that we're not as centralized in one geography or two geographies of downtown Toronto and Montreal, and getting out and also better representing and being in communities across the nation, filling some of those deserts where the private sector has abandoned Canadians. And also just really thinking how you can innovate and invest in innovation, whether that's just building up the next generation of journalists, but also there have been arguments made in the past about, the CBC serving less as its own network and more of a production house that then can make content for other facilities. I don't think that's the direction to go, but maybe it could help innovate in the sector. A great example is that, a lot of news organizations were pretty much decimated financially when classified ads all went online and they weren't prepared because Kijiji took them out. why couldn't a Canadian news organization or media group have invented their own Kijiji, right? Or whether it's their own social media platform or different methods to deliver news to Canadians, maybe that is a role where the public broadcaster could find actually a new mandate where they could help with innovation in the sector, because private companies don't want to invest in that. So I think it's about thinking outside the box and being willing to let go of a lot of the past that is now more of a luxury and just not relevant or valuable anymore.
I like that answer so much, specifically because you were like, hey, good for you for having this conversation. I was like, I want actually pats on the back from the whole table. So Rupa, I'm going to ask this question also to you. You're in charge of the mandate. What would you do tomorrow?
Well, a CBC TV, as I mentioned earlier, it's a no-brainer. It should be privatized. CBC Radio 2, I think, is adding zero value. All they're doing now is curating playlists at taxpayers'
You mean CBC
expense.
Music? Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely defund CBC Radio 2, CBC Radio 1.
Rupa, those are people I care about. Okay, you can't they are down the hall from me, and they do incredible work. They actually find Canadian musicians.
Say it to their faces, Rupa. How dare you?
Well, and she is, and she is. I'm the representative of their faces. Anyway,
yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, my cat's in the frame. Sorry about that.
It's fine.
CBC Radio 1, I actually do like it. But
you.
if it's a little more representative of the ideological spectrum that exists in Canada today, it could be funded by tiny amount of federal government money. It could be based on the NPR model, for example. And so that's where I would start. But you definitely don't need $1.2 or $1.3 billion to keep all of this going.
Harrison Lowman, once again, a conversation I've had in your basement so many times that I can immediately and automatically answer your answer for you, but I'm not going to do that. You are now in charge of the CBC mandate. Please, how would you change this place?
Years ago, I would have held a press conference owning, where we could have done better, what the CBC has sort of gone wrong, where we've been led astray, and, how we want to fix things in the future. That doesn't mean parroting conservative talking points. None of us here around this table are saying that the CBC needs like skewed conservative. No.
No, that's why you're
introducing
here.
more people around the table. Yeah. I would reinvest in local reporting, as Sabrina said. I would drop a lot of the entertainment, like Rupa said. I would further open up your archives. You guys have a wealth of stuff, Canadian history sitting below you, Elamin, that you should open up and provide to classrooms across the country. I know you're probably doing some of that already. I would say stop stealing our advertiser dollars. We are a private outlet. We do not take government subsidies here at the Hub. We need everything we can get, and we don't need the public broadcaster coming in after having $1.4 billion from the government and taking, additional money from a finite list of advertisers. I would change your hiring practices to introduce more viewpoint diversity while still trying to reflect the country back at itself. I would let readers potentially rate the bias in your articles. There's certain American outlets that are doing it at the bottom. You can have a little meter that you can move back and forth. And I would look towards the New York Times as a mainstream organization that leans left but is making attempts to sort of recalibrate, saying things now. I know words you may hate, Elamin, like the newsroom is not a safe space. You're going to be covering stories you may not like. Objectivity is key.
That? Hey, how do you know I hate that? What gives you that impression?
I don't know. Anyway, that is what I would do if I was given a day.
And today was the day that we gave you, pal. This is the best that I can do. I can't put you in charge of the CBC, but I can put you on this show, and I appreciate all of you and your viewpoints and your energy and the feistiness and the debate and the yelling and the not yelling that you brought to this conversation, because I think underneath all of it is also care and is also investment. I think it's like investment in what this institution represents, what this institution can be. We have different versions. Let's not be unclear about this. The three of you, even among the three of you, but also between the three of you and me, like we have different versions of what this institution at its best can be. But I also think I appreciate all of you bringing that care to this conversation. So I'm going to say Harrison and Rupa and Sabrina, thank you for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank
you so much
Elamin.
for having
Thank
us.
you.
Kudos to the CBC for having it.
Oh, come
Exactly.
on. Get out of
Totally.
here. Are you give me more pats on the back? That's very nice of you. Okay. Harrison Lowman is the managing editor of The Hub. Rupa Subramanya writes for the Free Press. And Sabrina Maddeaux is a freelance columnist. And look, yeah, we wanted to hear from our critics today because I do believe, despite of all of this, that dialogue is the best way to figure these things out. In the coming days, we're going to hear the other side of this conversation. There is a case to be made for the CBC. You're going to hear that as well. I'm a part of making that case for you, I think, or at least I hope so, every single day. But beyond the show, we're going to get into the reasons why the CBC also matters to people. That is coming up on a group chat later this week on Commotion. In the meantime, that's it for the show today. My name is Elamin Abdul Mahmoud, and we'll see you tomorrow.